Awesome. Great. So I'm super happy with the turnout today. We have a whole bunch of people on Teams and a whole bunch of people in person. So it's awesome to have such a good group here, and hopefully we can have a nice discussion about septic systems. And people who know me know that septic systems is my favorite topic in the whole world, which it's kind of a weird topic to kind of latch onto and make your own, but I do a lot of thinking in my free time about septic systems, and I'll be presenting to you today about some of the work that FB Environmental has done. Just letting someone else in here. That we have done in collaboration with the Piscataqua Region Estuaries Partnership and with the Town of Stratham over the past year. So we started in June of 2024 on this project, and we're just starting to wrap it up now. And we've made a lot of progress in just understanding what's been going on. So I'll walk you through our whole process, what we did, and I'll start right at the basics of what are septic systems, and by the end of this, we'll kind of understand what's going on in some parts of Stratham. So the first part, the most important thing is, this project was funded by a grant through the Piscataqua Region Estuaries Partnership. Abigail Lyon, who's in charge of that grant program, couldn't make it today. She had a conflict, but there's all sorts of these projects all throughout the region that PrEP funds, and it really helps kind of get some stuff off the ground. So a big shout out to PrEP for funding this, and I know they put a ton of care and love into their projects. And this was funded with support from the EPA through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also called the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So we have a few topics that we're going to discuss today. The first is, what are the basics of septic systems? What are they? What do they do? What is septic vulnerability? We'll also go over just very basic operations and maintenance of septic systems. And then we'll touch upon the work that Stratham's been doing in collaboration with PrEP and with us to kind of understand what vulnerability is like in the town. So everything starts with what goes on in our homes. So, we use the laundry machine, the dishwasher, garbage disposals, the shower, toilet, sink. All of that comes through our internal plumbing, and then it will exit our house through external plumbing. Waste will all collect into our septic tank, which is most of the times underneath and kind of, underneath part of the yard. And that's a really important place just because, things start to kind of break down. There's a lot of bacteria doing some good stuff in there, but it's also where fats, other lipids and solids will all separate from the wastewater. So you'll have a fatty layer on the top, you have wastewater in the middle, which we call effluent, and at the bottom is sludge, which is all of those solids. Then wastewater will exit through a pipe and enter what's called the distribution box. I'm gonna, sorry, let someone else into the Zoom room. Perfect. Welcome to our presentation. We just got started. So only the wastewater will exit the septic tank. So all of the fats are going to stay in the septic tank, as well as all of the solids. So just the wastewater will exit into the distribution box, and then it will disperse into these pipes, which we call the disposal field, and that percolates into the soil that's on the property. So they'll bring in some sand or maybe stone and pipe, and it goes through there first, but then once it gets past what's been brought in, it goes right into the native soil, and what's there really dictates how well wastewater is treated on a property. The other thing is that, solids, since they stay in that tank, they need to be routinely pumped out or else the system can back up. And as I mentioned, the soil beneath the disposal field is really what's responsible for the final step of wastewater treatment. And that treatment can be more or less complete depending on the soil characteristics. And I'll go into all of those different types of traits and how they relate to septic vulnerability on the following slides. Septic systems can malfunction or fail, which I'm sure a lot of you know. But what happens is basically wastewater tries to go down into the soil, but there's a variety of things that can happen. Either the soil is holds on to water too well, or there's been a buildup of organic matter underneath the pipes from just years and years of use. The system can be very old. It can have installation or operations and maintenance errors. But when a system fails, it poses an immediate public health concern because wastewater can come up to the surface and it can pond on that leach field, like in that photo you're seeing on the left side of the screen. And if there's little kids running around, dogs especially, you don't want them rolling around in wastewater that hasn't been treated. So definitely a public health concern, and it's also a water quality concern. If leach fields are connected hydrologically to drainage ditches on the side of the road, then that wastewater can then go into the drainage system, which then gets discharged to a water body. Or if it rains, that can all get pushed off and can enter our streams and rivers through runoff. There's also underperformance, which is a less talked about topic. This can occur if basically the soils are too coarse for wastewater treatment to be complete. So, think about how fast water goes through on the beach if you dump out your water bottle into the beach sand, right? It goes super fast into the ground. And some of our soils here in New Hampshire can be very sandy, but also very gravelly and have a lot of cobble in them. And when that happens, wastewater kind of shoots right through and doesn't have that time to sit in the soil and be treated. So that's another thing that we look out for that kind of, it gets overlooked sometimes. And when, septic systems first started being permitted in the 70s, they actually wanted these types of soils because they weren't thinking about, what happens when it gets into the groundwater. They really just wanted to make sure that wastewater kind of disappeared down there so that we didn't have any of those backups that I was mentioning on the last slide. So why do we care about septic systems and their, when they fail and malfunction and when they underperform and can pollute groundwater? So wastewater contains all sorts of pollutants, namely phosphorus, and then I have here bolded nitrogen and pathogens. And those ones we really care about here in Stratham because we're in this coastal system with the Great Bay. And the Squamscott River, the Winnicott River, and Great Bay are all impaired for nitrogen. And then we also have a couple of pathogen impairments in town, such as Parkman Brook is impaired for high levels of bacteria. And obviously that all leads right into Great Bay. So those are two key pollutants of concern, especially for this area. I will mention wastewater also has a whole slew of emerging contaminants that I haven't listed here, such as pharmaceuticals, PFAS, other microplastics, but I'm just going to focus on these for today. So excessive nitrogen loading from septic systems can cause what's called coastal eutrophication, and it can make swimming, boating, shellfishing, and other recreation unsafe. So obviously, if there's a ton of bacteria, you don't want to go swim in that, and you especially don't want, your kids or other people's kids to be swimming. And when, coastal ecosystems eutrophy, it basically means there's a whole bunch more algae growing, and that can be very bad for the aquatic life that live there. Septic systems are estimated to make up 30% of the total nitrogen load to Great Bay. So, nitrogen comes from all sorts of things. Even, car exhaust is one source of nitrogen. Animal waste is one source. Leaf litter that falls on the ground, grass clippings, all of those are all nitrogen sources, and septic systems are 30% of the nitrogen that makes it to Great Bay. So it's a pretty big number that we're thinking about here.
Is that the biggest one?
Can't confirm, but I would assume watershed sources such as like fertilizer runoff, and lumping in agriculture with that too. I'd assume that's probably a bigger source. But 30% is probably the second biggest source. So when we think about water quality, we think about our beautiful ecosystems we have here in New Hampshire. We like to walk trails, walk by the pretty ocean. I know I do. What can happen is things like this. This is a macroalgae bloom. This is actually further down south, you can see the palm trees. It's tropical. But when you have a lot of nitrogen, it can make this algae grow, and then it washes up on our beaches, and that's not a lot of fun. And then we can also have coastal harmful algal blooms, which are, cyanobacteria or other types of algae that really proliferate in the water, and they can turn it this sickly green color. And the worst part is they can produce toxins. So, that's something that we're concerned about. And then our worst case scenario is fish kills. And that's something that we know happens in Long Island Sound. And septic systems are a huge issue down there. Luckily in New Hampshire, we love our beaches. We know they sometimes close for bacteria. But, luckily we're not experiencing these coastal harmful algal blooms, and we're not experiencing fish kills. So, anything we can do to be proactive can prevent this from happening. And, we don't want to wait till something catastrophic happens to kind of be on alert. But I also don't want this to be a scare tactic too. So I'll give a short primer on how pollutants are treated in septic systems, and that will kind of lead us into our discussion about vulnerability. Once you know kind of how nitrogen moves through, then you can know what makes it not be treated so well. So soils are very, very effective at treating phosphorus and bacteria as long as the system is not failing. Phosphorus is usually treated at 90% plus efficiency if the soil conditions are right, which is pretty good. But nitrogen, on the other hand, soils can treat about half, 40% of the nitrogen, and most of it continues down through the groundwater. The other thing is that nitrogen moves very, very quickly through the groundwater, pretty much at the same speed as the groundwater. So, obviously, groundwater is moving kind of slow, not at the same speed as our rivers and streams, but in terms of pollutants, nitrogen can move very quickly through the ground, and especially in highly transmissive areas like where we have aquifers. There's a couple here in town. It can move very, very fast and discharge to our water bodies. Nitrogen can also denitrify out of the aquifer, though, which is a good thing. I'm not going to get too in the weeds about how that process works, but it's not just once it gets into the soil, it's there forever and discharges. There's some removal happening once it's in the ground. So let's talk a little bit about septic system performance. As I mentioned before, septic systems can fail, and I kind of listed a whole slew of reasons. One cause of failure is if the soils themselves are unsuitable. So if you install a system on clay or anything that's too fine, as that's not very good at letting water go through it. Water kind of sticks to the clay and will stay there for a very long time. So if you install a system on soil that's too fine, the system will very easily back up. And it's the same thing if there's a shallow water table on site. If you think about, having enough space for wastewater to go through, if you have a shallow water table and you're adding more water in there, it can very easily back up to the surface if you don't have enough space in between. If the system is old, we use a general cutoff of 25 years old, but in actuality, systems can function for up to 40 plus years sustainably without failing. And sometimes there's systems that are installed and a year later it happens to fail. So, we use it as a general cutoff, mostly just so people are kind of wary of what's going on the property once you get past 25 years. But age isn't necessarily the best indicator of failure. Damage and installation errors obviously can lead to failures if something's not done right. And then if a system's installed on a steep slope, effluent can actually break out of the side of the system. So that's another type of failure that we think about. Poor performance will occur when the soil is too coarse, as I mentioned before, and also can occur if there's a shallow water table or bedrock. So, all of that treatment's kind of going to happen above the water table in this kind of brown area that's on the screen. And once you get down into that gray area, there's a lot less treatment that happens. So if you can picture, if that gray line was moved way up, there's just less space for treatment to happen there. Also, if you're located too close to a water body, especially for nitrogen, that's something that we're thinking about. So what makes a septic system vulnerable to failure? It's all of those same things that I just talked about with the soils. Any system that's, on soils that are shallow to bedrock or the water table installed on a steep slope, or if they have soil features that lead to poor infiltration or even like ponding, those are all soil characteristics that make the system more susceptible to failure. As you can see, there's a soil test pit on the left side of the screen. And you can see there's a little pool of water at the bottom there. That's at about 45 to 50 centimeters. And so that's a great example of, shallow water table. And, the soils in this test pit probably would not be good for treating wastewater. There's also characteristics that increase our risk to pollution or risk of pollution from septic systems. So I kind of like to separate the idea of vulnerability and risk in my head. I think of vulnerability as, how likely is it that something goes wrong? And then risk in my head is, when something goes wrong, how likely is it to actually make an impact downstream? So there's some things that really increase our risk. The first is being close to water bodies and wetlands. Obviously, the closer you are, the less space there is before the water gets there. The second is flood zones, obviously areas where a lot of water is going to come in and sweep stuff up. Any water that's flooding will transport any pollutants downstream. The last is highly transmissive aquifers. As I mentioned, there's a couple here in town, and they're labeled there on the map. And if the groundwater is moving very, very quickly, and obviously a septic system is a discharge to the groundwater, then any pollutants that get there will move there very, very fast. So septic system operations and maintenance, this is super, super important because it's the one thing that you all as homeowners can control. The do's, I think the most important thing that you could ever do is just arm yourself with knowledge, just like coming to events like this, learning more about septic systems. And if you leave this kind of curious, you can dig up your septic system permit and kind of see where your leach field is on the property and all of that type of stuff. Kind of just knowing what's going on is super important. It's kind of, in my opinion, it's kind of fun, but I'm the one who's interested in this. Another thing is to limit water use and to be mindful of your system. So I'll go through it on the don'ts, but there's a number of things that you shouldn't dump down your drain if you have a septic system. And especially in times where there's a lot of rainfall or like heavy torrential downpours, limiting your water use can be a really effective tool to prevent failures because, the soils are already saturated with a ton of water. So just think about adding even more to that. That'll prevent anything from backing up. And then knowing the signs of failure is super important. So, if you find your leach field and it's super squishy or has like swelled a little bit, that's a sign of failure. If you see kind of water ponding on the surface, that's another sign of failure. And then as you can see there, you have really lush green grass. That's also a sign that things are kind of backing up and not making it through all the way. And then the grass that's over your leach field is absolutely loving it because there's all sorts of nutrients in there for them to take up. And then when it gets really bad, your internal plumbing can slow down. So you can see your sink is slow to drain. And worst case scenario, it'll back up into your basement, which is, worst case. You don't want that to happen. Your don'ts, you don't want to plant deeply rooted vegetation over the leach field. Roots can kind of get in and they'll, just like when you have a plant on the windowsill that kind of leans toward the sun, it's the same thing. The roots are going to find where the water's coming from and where all those nutrients are, and they'll plug up all the holes and it creates a whole mess. Harsh chemicals, don't pour them down the drain. There's a whole list of them. I can't name them off the top of my head, but they can kind of kill all of the good bacteria that's in the tank and just slow down how quickly waste breaks down. The garbage disposal, originally this said just overuse. I talked to a septic system installer recently who said never use the garbage disposal if you have a septic system. So as you can picture, it just adds to the amount of solids in there, and there's even more organic matter that's going to clog up your leach field at the end of the day. Last part is just don't drive vehicles over the leach field. You can imagine heavy machinery on soil. can both compact the soil, but also can just like dislodge system components. It's, also all installed pretty level, and it can make things go off balance. So that's another important thing there. For maintenance, we want to get our systems pumped and inspected on a regular basis. Um, there's all sorts of ranges of time that people recommend. But we typically say an inspection every 1 to 3 years is pretty good. And getting the septic tank pumped every 3 to 5 years is a pretty good timeline, depending on your usage of the home. So, 3 years if you have, a lot of visitors in and out, a big house. 5 years maybe if you're more seasonal, or if you go on a lot of vacations, or if it's, just you and someone else and you don't use a ton of water. Pumping would be performed by a licensed septic tank pumper or hauler, and they just pump the tank out to remove the sludge. I believe it's a couple $100 to have it done. For a septic inspection, which in New Hampshire is called an evaluation, a New Hampshire certified evaluator must do it, and they'll inspect all mechanical components of the leach field. They'll assess if it's failing, if there's water that's ponding, and they'll recommend remedial actions, which sometimes might include replacing the whole system. These are a little bit more expensive. I believe it's like $200 to $300, if not a little bit more. But it's, super important maintenance, and if it's, it seems expensive, but then that one time wastewater will back up into the basement and then it's a much bigger mess. So I'm going to move now into how we assess septic vulnerability and kind of what that looked like for Stratham. Our first step is a big mapping process. This is kind of what we call a co-occurrence analysis, where we'll look at all the different features within town that are relevant to septic systems and just see where they all overlap together. So we looked at things like the aquifers, where surface waters are, where wetlands are, where our flood zones are, and then we looked at a number of soil characteristics to, see where all of our vulnerabilities stacked up, and then saw, which areas things actually looked okay. Our second step was to create a septic system inventory. So there's all sorts of, all of the data we get through our mapping is great. A lot of it is national size data sets. So you can imagine sometimes the resolution's a little bit coarse. Septic system permits and plans give us a whole other level of detail that you'd never be able to get through mapping. So these two things kind of go hand in hand together, and we can get a pretty comprehensive look at septic systems in the town. We also created a mapper. It's kind of just like an interactive tool. I'm going to skip over that for time today. So before I go into, running through these results with you all, I want to stress some important caveats first. The most important thing is that this is a planning level tool, which means that these risk categories that I have presented here, those are just relative risk. Pretty much we look at the lowest score in the town, the highest score in the town, and split it into categories. But very high risk doesn't necessarily mean there's a catastrophe happening on these areas of land. It just means, of the area we looked at, these are the ones that ranked the highest, and the ones at the other end, those are the ones that ranked the lowest. Similarly, high risk does not necessarily mean that that area is causing pollution to the Squamscott River and Great Bay. It just means, as I mentioned, what is the chance that something could go wrong, and what is the chance that when something goes wrong, it would impact a water body. I'll also mention Stratham is generally at low risk, so the highest possible score is 9, and you can see the very high risk is 6+, and most of the town is not anywhere near that. So same thing, I don't want to, this isn't like a scare tactic, not trying to raise alarm bells here. So areas that are high risk, coastal and shoreline areas, obviously that kind of makes sense, right? Intuitively. And obviously a lot of them, you can see those bright reds, are undeveloped, and most of them are protected lands. The Stratham Hill area, there's a couple of neighborhoods there where there's some high risk spots. High Street, so you can see that big red area, that's actually a giant wetland. So there's no development happening there anyway, but the neighborhoods around there also kind of fell into this high risk area. Bunker Hill Ave, where we are right now, these neighborhoods and this road kind of stuck out as a hotspot as well of just like a higher risk area. And then the Portsmouth Ave corridor, which I drove up on the way here, where there's a lot of not residents, businesses, also stuck out as a potential area to think about. So another thing that we really wanted to take into consideration was climate change and how that's going to impact septic vulnerability. As I mentioned before, flooding is a huge issue for septic systems, and high groundwater is a huge issue for septic systems. Both of those things are really impacted by climate change. And there's, as you've seen, sea level rise predictions, and sea level rise will even exacerbate coastal flooding, especially in New Hampshire. And same thing with groundwater. So groundwater is predicted to rise just like sea level will due to all of that extra water coming in. So that map that you saw before was kind of our current conditions, 2025. And I'll point out in the bottom, you can see it, there's some parcels that have been blacked out. Those are parcels that are on sewer right now connected to Exeter's system. So right now, about 7% of the parcels in town are considered at high risk of septic system failure or pollution. As we move into 2050, you can see that kind of expanded to a much bigger area. So, the whole coastal area becomes more vulnerable to septic failure, but also a lot of the inland area does too. And much of that is because of groundwater rise predicted for Stratham. So by 2050, and I'll mention for 2050, we used 2 feet of sea level rise based on guidance documents that were produced, I believe it was by UNH, or at least they're available through UNH. But we used 2 feet of sea level rise for 2050, and that led to our analysis showed us 15% of parcels are at risk of of septic system failure by 2050. So that's a pretty big increase of our current conditions. When we move into 2100, I'll go back so you can kind of see how it creeps up, but it fills in even more inland, right? So when we think about climate change, we're really concerned about that coastal area, especially near the Squamscott River, where there can be a lot more flooding in the future. But really, groundwater rise is going to affect the whole town, and is likely to impact how well septic systems here are going to treat pollutants. So that increases. We went from 7 to 15. Now, by 2100, 18% of the parcels may be at high risk of septic system pollution. Our second step was the inventory. And this here is a septic system plan. And I'll go through the different parts of this plan that we kind of pull off that we think are useful. The first is the design. So it's kind of difficult to see, but this is a raised septic system. Basically means, there's the ground surface. I'm sure you've seen them when you've driven by people's homes. But places where the soil is not exactly suitable, they'll actually bring in a whole bunch of material and they'll install the septic system above the original ground surface. And that's really important because if we look at the soil types and say, well, the groundwater is really shallow here, and then we look at the permit and see that they used a raised system, then we know that there was some remedial action there to kind of make the soils work for the site. We also have the exact location of the leach field. This is really important for our bigger parcels where, you might not necessarily know where the system's going to be placed. And if you think about, in the context of those maps, you can have very high risk on one end of the parcel and very low on the other. So the exact location is really helpful just to know, what those soils are at that location. We also have soil test pit data, which is super interesting to look at. And as I mentioned, sometimes soil maps are not the best. And so it gives just a great comparison between what's on the map and what did someone actually find when they went and dug a hole there. And of course, the most important thing, the approval date and number, so we know how old the system was. And then if we have any questions, we can go back and search it up in the state database, and all of that information will pop up for us. So we didn't have our grant only covered a portion of the town. So we decided to focus on this northern section of Stratham. We talked a lot with Susan, who's over there, kind of just about what the right area would be. And this kind of, I know it looks kind of jagged and weird, but this is actually the watershed of the northern part of the Squamscott River in Stratham.
So that studies and concentrated on that area?
Yeah, just the inventory focused on that area. So we have the mapping for the whole town, but the inventory is only confined to this one portion. So septic system age is one important thing to look at. This is kind of a scattered map here, but I'm going to call out a couple of areas. So what we saw was there's a couple neighborhoods that are kind of old. They were built in the 70s, and anywhere you see a circle with an X through it, that means we didn't find anything at all. And usually the assumption, if you can't find anything, means that the system was installed way, way back before they were even permitting these at the state level, and that it's likely the original system that was there right when they built the house. And the other thing I'll mention is you'll see kind of clusters of the same colored dots. That really just means that all of the systems that are there are the original ones that were built when the home was built. So all of those kind of subdivisions went in, and all the homes were built at the same time, and they all have their original septic systems. The other thing I'll note, so as I mentioned, we have exact locations for a lot of the leach fields. One thing is there's a lot of community septic systems in this portion of Stratham, which is a really great tool because of all of those operations and maintenance things I was going over before. If you think about a neighborhood, right, every homeowner on that street needs to think about their septic system. Is it being maintained? Am I dumping stuff down the drain that I shouldn't be dumping? Am I growing deeply rooted vegetation over it? If you have a community septic system, it means all of the wastewater from this whole road is all routed into one septic system, which means if there's an issue with it, everyone on the street kind of knows that something's going on. And there's usually kind of one central force in charge of making sure that it's maintained. So all of those concerns about operations and maintenance, the burden's kind of taken off of everybody on the street and is kind of on one central figure. It also allows, especially on smaller parcels, that don't have like a lot of area and might not have good soils, it allows you to find another more uphill location that has better soils. And it avoids some of those vulnerabilities that we were talking about. So there's a lot of those throughout the town, and I've just circled a couple here. The next thing is the depth to the seasonal high water table. I was talking a lot about groundwater today. And I'm not expecting, this map's kind of jumbled, but just to show you, we got all of that data. So if there's a system that the town is curious about, they can go and look how high was the water table when they did the evaluation and how does that translate to the risk. And I'll note, so the colors on the map here are showing projected groundwater rise by the year 2100. As you can see, the darker areas are projected to rise by 3 feet, which is pretty significant. And then obviously as you get further from the coast, it kind of wanes. But all of those systems, besides kind of the dark blue ones, will have shallow groundwater by 2100. So luckily that's 75 years away, but definitely something to keep in mind for the future. So there's a few strategies that are used everywhere to try to make our wastewater treatment a little bit better. The first one on the top left there is an advanced enviroseptic septic system. There's all sorts of advanced septic systems. Those ones reduce the amount of organic material basically that's in wastewater. So then I was talking kind of about the soil clogs and then the system backs up. It pretty much just makes the system more resilient to that failure. The one on the bottom right below it is a raised septic system. As I was mentioning before, if you have shallow groundwater or unsuitable soils, just bringing in extra material and just giving it some extra distance can really pay dividends for wastewater treatment. Cluster or community septic systems, These I mentioned were used all throughout our study area, which was great to see. And as you can see, there's one leach field, so it's a bigger area, but you can pick a better spot. And those 4 homeowners do not really need to worry as much about the individual practices. There's usually like a homeowners association or someone else who is kind of appointed to think about it. Nitrogen reducing septic systems are newer technologies, which I actually did not find any in Stratham, which kind of makes sense. They're a little expensive. But what they do, instead of us worrying about that slog of nitrogen coming in through the groundwater and polluting our coastal ecosystems, most of the nitrogen is treated on site in this kind of little mini packaged wastewater treatment plant that's on your property. It basically has an aerobic and an anaerobic chamber in there, and it removes all of that nitrogen. And it can reduce it. I won't provide the number because I don't think the number will mean much, but I believe it's up to like 70%. So it's pretty good for nitrogen treatment. And these are kind of emerging in use, especially in other areas of New England. So then it's, the question is, what do we do? There's a whole bunch of recommendations that we have here, and they're all, I'll give another caveat, they're all potential recommendations. The big thing here is, this was not a capital planning project. So, we really kind of, we looked at the soil maps, the vulnerability, we looked at the inventory data, but we didn't look at costs, projected costs, anything like that, to assess the viability of any of these. So these are really just kind of food for thought, discussion topics, things for the town to look into, but not necessarily, we're not saying here's your silver bullet, go and do this. And I'm not going to read through these. I have subsequent slides that will go through these ones that are bolded. The first is to increase septic system setbacks for all water bodies and wetlands. Currently, Stratham zoning ordinance requires a 75-foot setback between septic systems and wells and a 100-foot setback from a water body. But there's all sorts of things that are not included in the definition of a water body. So, little brooks and streams, and, wetlands and such. PrEP, the Piscataqua Region Estuaries Partnership, who also funded this project, they recommended in their 2020 assessment to increase setbacks to 100 feet. And kind of what you can see here is, I've just provided a small diagram. The more space you have in between the leach field and the water body, just the more time and space there is for that wastewater, if it fails, to seep into the ground and therefore not run off. Another recommendation was to potentially assess viability of collaborating with Exeter to expand sewer services. This is a food for thought kind of idea, not, I'm not saying go do this. But as part of this project, we took a look at the town's master plan. And there's a few prioritized growth areas there, and especially, there's a whole bunch of priorities that the town discussed in that plan, which included, providing better housing opportunities for young families and for older families, and then also, but also maintaining the rural feel that Stratham is known for. And so I picked out just a couple of areas here. There's in the bottom right is the special housing district. And I believe in the master plan, it was recommended to put in like retirement communities there. So that could be one potential area to expand sewer, especially because it's right near those existing sewer lines at the industrial complex. And then the Portsmouth Ave corridor, which I had pulled out before as a vulnerable area, there's a ton of businesses there. Restaurants can be kind of intense uses for septic systems. There's a lot of organic material that's coming in, right? There's a lot of food waste that's generated. And there's a couple, you can see them, black parcels down there. So those are parcels that are already connected to Exeter's sewer system. They're actually kind of like partially in Stratham, partially in Exeter. But, those are right near the border of the two towns. So just, one idea of ways to, improve wastewater treatment while also just aligning with the goals that the town laid out in their master plan. Another idea is to require community septic systems for new subdivisions within the residential agricultural zoning district. That zoning district is this whole tan area that's throughout the town. And as you can see, there's a lot of open space where there's no roads, and where you build a new road, that's a new subdivision, right? So it's just, a good strategy to kind of take the onus of operations and maintenance off of the homeowner, is to think about using, requiring that community septic be used in these instances. Another one is to require additional vertical separation distance in areas vulnerable to groundwater rise. And I provided that same map here. The current state standard is a 2-foot vertical separation. I believe there's some areas in Stratham where a 4-foot separation is required. And one recommendation would be to increase that distance to 4 feet. More protective than our state standards. Sure, yeah. So I spoke earlier about the groundwater seasonal high water table.
Right.
The vertical separation distance is just from that groundwater table up to the bottom of the disposal field where those pipes are.
It's only 2 feet right now?
2 feet is the state standard.
Holy cow.
So one potential thing the town could think about is requiring an additional vertical separation distance. So you have maybe 4 feet until you hit the water table. And through the test pit data, that actually was pretty common throughout town where you had enough. And in places you don't, you can bring in additional material and have a raised septic system. So that's another thing to think about, especially for the future. I've lumped these two, established a cost share or funding program for septic maintenance and replacements, and require maintenance contracts or employ other maintenance structures. So the EPA has this kind of whole guidance document about how to set up a cost sharing program. And it ranges all the way from, just reaching out to homeowners to the town owns and operates every septic system. There's a whole range of ways that it can be implemented. But one that we've been thinking a lot about at FB Environmental is the idea of a septic fee. So some areas, I know Massachusetts has a lot of them. They have stormwater fees where they kind of charge, it's kind of like a tax for the amount of impervious area per home. And that goes into a fund for the town to better manage stormwater. A septic fee would be very similar, where each septic user kind of pays into this fund, and then the town would be able to disperse those funds to homeowners for routine maintenance. So instead of worrying every time that it's time to get the system pumped or maintained and saying, oh, that's another $300 down the drain, that the money's there and that the town can help you with it and that it's taken care of because you've been paying into it for some time. And especially, there's a lot of people who, on, a $300 bill for having your septic system inspected can be prohibitive. And we want to make sure, our septic systems serve a public health function. And so it can be beneficial to kind of approach that maintenance publicly. The other thing is maintenance contracts. Those are more decentralized. It kind of shifts the responsibility from like a town or a water and sewer department onto a contractor. So what the town could do is require that every new septic system enter a maintenance contract with a contractor. This is an example of one here. I'll read off what it says because I know the text is really small, but it says maximum time between pumping the septic tank shall not exceed 2 years. And it also says the clean solution system shall be inspected every 2 years by a technician. Basically what that means is there's a contract that is in place between the homeowner and a contractor that gets submitted to the town. And it's a little bit harder to enforce, but that way, someone's going out to look at the system, or at least there's a mechanism in place to make sure someone's thinking about it. Another thing is implementing a septic pump out or maintenance ordinance. There's a whole bunch of towns in New Hampshire that are doing this. And that's actually, I'm sorry, it's not an ordinance, it's a health regulation. So there's a whole different public process involved, between those two things. And a health regulation is actually easier. So I want to stress that here because that's not what it says on the slide. But towns such as Rye, Sunapee, Meredith, New Durham, Enfield. They're all doing this. They're requiring pump outs either every 3 years or every 5 years. And it really just gets people thinking about what's happening on their property with their septic system. And just like beyond knowing that someone has gone out and pumped it, the homeowner awareness is really just increasing in those areas because people know that they have to do something and then they want to learn why they need to do it. And then they kind of fall down this rabbit hole of how it pertains to water quality and public health. Another potential recommendation is to require advanced nitrogen reducing systems in sensitive areas. I'll preface this by saying that they are very expensive. A regular conventional septic replacement is around like $12,000 plus. These ones are upwards of like $30,000. So what other places have done, such as Charlestown, Rhode Island, and Nassau and Suffolk counties in New York, they actually have programs. I believe some of them are funded by the EPA, and then others, they've pursued all sorts of grants. But basically what they do is they provide 50% of the cost of the septic system to the homeowner to upgrade it. So you can imagine that's probably like an $18,000 grant that you would get from the county to upgrade your septic system. And the IRS actually recently ruled that that money cannot be taxed, which is a good thing. And what I'll also mention is that in these areas here, because of what's been happening in Long Island Sound and the Atlantic Ocean, the states have actually required that every new system be an advanced septic system, which, that hasn't happened here in New Hampshire, but it could happen one day. And, if we're trying to be extra protective of our resources, it's good to think about, funding mechanisms for that, and how effective those systems are, because they're seeing an increase in use, especially in New England. And that's just another diagram. And that's all I had for you today. Thank you all for coming. And if you have any questions, I'll look at the Zoom room. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and I'll take questions from you all as well. All right. I saw a question here.
Yes. Who is doing inspections? You mentioned that, there are inspection companies, when I get the septic tank.
Mhm.
Emptied for 2 or 3 years, but who's doing inspections in Massachusetts? That the same people that empty a tank are also doing inspections.
Mhm.
So what's it like here?
Yeah, so a licensed evaluator has to do it here, and there's a whole bunch of them all throughout the state. I believe DES has a list of them, but I'm sure there's some in the area as well. And I have a couple of their business cards, not on me, but I believe that information is accessible on the DES website.
Great.
You can ask the person that you have coming to pump if they have a licensed evaluator
Sure.
as well.
Mhm.
A lot of larger companies have both.
Yeah.
It's my understanding that when you put in a new septic system or you replace a septic system in leach fields, you have to go through the state DES to get an approval for it.
Mhm.
Now, it seems to me a reasonable way to start a process of assessing the risks of a particular area would be when you put your application in through there, that the town would look at it and say, well, this is a vulnerable area for us, so we should have you do such and such to reduce the risk of failure.
Yeah.
So what happens with that?
Yeah.
Does that really happen or not?
Well, so the big thing at the state level is, none of the standards were designed for nitrogen or phosphorus removal. They are all designed specifically just to get the wastewater into the ground and make sure it doesn't back up, is kind of their main
Does the
thing.
town itself have authority or right to tell somebody who's putting in such a system, hey, even though this is what the state says, our rules are a little higher, our standards are higher.
So towns can do that. I worked with a couple in Maine that have done the same thing where, the state regulation there is actually 12 inches of vertical separation. They required 36. And it was kind of just before, it was just an extra step in that process.
So it can be done.
Can be done
If the town.
if the town passes an ordinance.
Was I correct in seeing that in Stratham, it's only 2 feet?
In all of New
Separation
Hampshire, it's
distance?
only 2 feet.
2 feet in separation.
How does Stratham rate in your overall sample of towns and cities you go to at 7% risk? I mean, is that in the lower quadrant or average or where is it?
Yeah, I mean, most of the town was pretty low risk. It was mostly just coastal areas, and then also the future risk was really kind of the big things to think about, and the groundwater rise and how that might impact future wastewater treatment. But most of the town was pretty low risk. There weren't a lot of spots that stuck out.
Have there ever been any incidences of health problems with respect to septic system failures?
Yeah, I heard of one in Harpswell, Maine, where I think a family actually died because the septic system was failing. I forget what the bacteria was, but it was one of those really bad ones. It was one of the ones where like you see it on the news, someone went to like a hotel and stayed in a hot tub, or like went in a hot tub, and one of those types of ones. So it definitely is a real, yeah, it's a very real thing that happens.
That's an interesting point. What do you tell people who have hot tubs to do with the water when they get rid of it?
Yeah. Well, I'm not a hot tub guy.
Somebody who pumps that out and,
Yeah.
to a wastewater.
Okay, so we have a couple questions. We have sometimes there's an odor from a septic system. What does that mean? If there's an odor around the leach field, like outside where the wastewater is being dispersed into the ground, that could be a sign of failure. And I would definitely get that inspected and checked out to make sure everything's going okay. Another one is the database of locations and specifications for existing septic systems available to the public now. If so, what is the link? So we'll be providing that information to the town at the end of this project. And I'm not sure if it's going to be available.
So Susan Connor's the planning assistant. We do have this whole thing up on our web page that we can add more of this to it now. It's not sharing there.
That's okay. I can,
Oh,
if you get it up, I can.
yeah, okay, so planning and well, actually, show them planning and then you can scroll down to where's septic. Oh, I'm sorry, you have to go to departments.
Planning and zoning.
Yep. And then on the left, it says septic, but
Okay.
let them sort of see where it is if you can share that. And we'll add more of.
Ooh, so close. Okay. And share. All right.
Yeah, so it's down where you guys are in the room down there.
Yeah. So if you go to,
Please click here, yep.
yeah, if you go to departments and you go to planning and zoning and click in, it'll bring you to this page. And then if you come down to septic system vulnerability assessment, it's in here. It has its own page. There's tonight's event. And oh, I forgot to mention, it's also Septic Smart Week.
Yeah. So we'll
Happy-
add tomorrow or so, I'll add, well, actually, I'm not back till next week, but I'll add the
Mhm.
PowerPoint and we'll try to upload the video too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I'm sure, as we submit to them our final product, more information will be available, including this presentation.
The takeaway is not to worry now, but worry in 25 or 50 years.
Well, worry a little bit now about doing your routine maintenance and operations and just making sure everything is working with your septic system. That's probably the biggest takeaway. And talk to your neighbors about it too.
Question, do you have any idea how long it takes for the regular wastewater that you say goes out into the leach field?
Mhm.
Is it daily? Will a single day exit the tank within a single day, or is it weeks or?
I can't give an exact answer. There's different designs of septic systems that do different things. So pressure dosed ones, they have like a really nice cool clock where it's like every hour they disperse a little bit. But I do know sometimes, especially for a conventional one, it will relate to how much water you use that day.
Okay.
Like if you use a ton of water, a ton will shoot out.
It's not related on, it's not just gravity.
It is gravity fed, but it kind of like, if your wastewater hasn't built up enough, then it needs to get
See, has to rise a certain amount before the gravity takes up. Before
Exactly.
the opening
Mhm,
is admitted.
mhm. Exactly. See if the Zoom room has any questions.
Could these leach fields be saturated? In other words, not be able to absorb any more
Um,
of the materials you're worried about?
yeah, so in terms of nitrogen, not really. So what you're saying is there a maximum capacity for pollutants to be treated?
Yeah.
For phosphorus, so they used to believe that there was one, but a lot of recent evidence is showing that phosphorus can be sustainably retained in soils for up to 40 plus years, which is a pretty big finding. And then bacteria, no, because it will kind of just die off. It kind of gets stuck to the soil particle and then it dies. And then, it breaks down and then it's no longer, that site is free again. And then similarly with nitrogen, as I said, is not treated very well. And so anything that sticks to a soil particle will very quickly detach and keep going through the groundwater. But then denitrification is the process through which nitrogen is removed. And that's a biological thing where bacteria are basically using carbon that's in the soil and the nitrogen, and then it leaves as gas. So it's not a type of thing where it gets retained and then it builds up over time. It's actually leaving through gaseous form. But there's other things in wastewater, such as little tiny solids and a lot of organic matter, and that will build up over time at the bottom underneath the pipes. And that can, once that builds up, it kind of impedes wastewater going through, and that will back up and cause a failure. So that's kind of why we talk about lifespan, and which is kind of, it can be a good indicator sometimes because that organic matter does build up over time, but also, it's neither here nor there whether or not an old system is necessarily failing.
Think you'll ever be able to pump? You can pump the waste out of the septic tank.
Mhm.
Think there'll be a time when you can pump the waste out of a leach field to avoid that problem?
So what they'll do is if a leach field needs to be replaced, if it's failing, they can replace it in the same spot and they can just excavate all of that material.
That resonated with you, recommendations that you felt, oh yeah, I would apply that home.
We have that one clean solution, that.
Mhm.
And we're in a process of pumping those tanks out every year. Every year, not every 3 years, every year.
Mhm.
So open to.
But I think
a
part of the
recommendation
problem
on
was
something.
the original septic tank itself may not have been large enough.
Mm.
I think they miscalculated
Mhm.
the number of people that were gonna be in the units or the usage in the units.
Mhm.
And that septic tank should have been much larger to
Mm.
accommodate the wastewater that was coming out of those units.
Mhm. So open to maybe pumping recommendations.
One thing that I note is that, a lot of people have the more modern, heating systems, whether they're burning oil, gas, whatever, they're at high efficiency. And what happens is you get a lot of, you're below the dew point level of the acid that is in the exhaust air. So now what happens is your acid, which is water, water-based, with water in it, goes into your pumps it into your septic system, and it goes into your
Mhm.
I've only started.
Okay, so now that's an issue. That's an issue because you don't want acid, even mild acid going into your septic system,
Mhm.
right? So all I know is what I do every 2 or 3 years is I have marbles, they're little marbles, and what they are neutralizing spheres
Mhm.
that neutralize the pH so that you're not dumping acid into your septic system.
Interesting.
That's something, anybody who has a modern boiler or heater, anything, for furnace, should put that in the system.
Mhm.
Mine happens to be in my sump pump, the pump that pumps the water
Mhm.
back into the septic system. They just don't, just show your water. And I just have a compartment, I stuff it with the neutralizing spheres that you can buy it, at plumbing supply houses.
Interesting. I've never heard of that before.
The idea of getting an inspection,
You
someday we're gonna be selling.
Mhm.
Why wait until, we've signed purchase and sales and they say our septic system's failing.
Mhm.
So it makes a lot of sense. As well as if, we were pumping yearly when it was $700,
Mhm.
and now it's a lot more. So we don't pump as much. Of course, just two of us now. The kids have moved out at the same time, so
Mhm.
it doesn't matter. But still, it'd be interesting to know, because you probably, even if you pump more often, it's gonna cost more money, as
Mhm.
well as it's a bigger load on wherever they send the stuff that they might not happen.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah. So definitely interesting to think about cost and what that means to people. Awesome. All right. So does anyone have any other questions? If not, we've hit 7 o'clock and that's the end of our presentation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all. Yeah.
I know,
All right.
and the hybrid worked out well.
Hybrid did work.
That's a different situation.
Top report.
You can buy heat pumps, heat
Oh.
conditioning.